Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's episode of Scrum Pulse. My name is Ravi Verma. I will be your moderator today, and I'm delighted to join you as part of this very interesting and fascinating topic that we're going to chat about today. Today we're going to talk about the role of testers in Agile. So we're moving to Agile. What are our testers going to do? And I'm honored to have our presenter, my colleague Pradeepa Narayanaswamy, as our presenter today. So welcome to the session. Let's get started by talking a little bit about this the series, the Scrum Pulse series, and what it's all about. So Pradeepa, if you could go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about the Scrum Pulse series. This is a free monthly webinar organized by Scrum.org. You can listen to this webinar in live as you are doing today, or you could watch the recording at your convenience. We have a library of recordings from our previous sessions available at Scrum.org/ScrumPulse, and you can also watch the recordings on YouTube. There is one unifying thread that runs across all of our sessions, and it is connected to the mission of Scrum.org, which is improving the profession of software development. And what we're trying to accomplish through these webinars is we're trying to elevate the conversation about agility and about Scrum, and we are trying to bring back the connection with empiricism and agility. We're using these webinars to explore how we can continuously deliver value to our business customers, and most importantly, we use these webinars as a way to have a conversation about how can we increase the level of trust and respect between business and IT. So those are some themes that you will see running across all of our webinars. Let's talk a little bit about logistics. So during this session, you're going to be placed on mute. So we do want your participation, we want your questions and comments, but to minimize the disruption and background noise. The way that you can communicate with us, a couple of ways. You can use the GoToWebinar questions panel, and you can see the screenshot there, and you can type in your questions. And you can also interact with us through Twitter. Just make sure that as you share a comment or a question, mention @Scrum.org and use the hashtag ScrumPulse. And so our team will be monitoring questions both on the GoToWebinar question panel as well as on Twitter. And as we reach the end of the session, we're going to take as many questions as we can. Okay. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Pradeepa. Pradeepa is an Agile coach and a professional Scrum trainer and a self-proclaimed Agile passionista. Pradeepa believes strongly in the Agile values and principles, and in her current role, she's working as a trainer, an Agile coach, and a mentor to many software teams, and she's helping them succeed in delighting their customers. She also works with leadership teams in their transformational journey and helps them apply Agile values and principles. Her specialization and passion is in the area of Agile testing, which is the topic of our presentation today. And she's a sought-after speaker in many national and international conferences. And on a personal note, Pradeepa loves traveling to different destinations, and she collects soaps that are made in each of the destinations that she visits. So with that, I'm honored and delighted to introduce Pradeepa, and I'd like to hand over the session to Pradeepa. So welcome.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you so much for joining me today for this webinar. Here is the agenda that we are going to go through. I'm going to talk about what is Agile testing. Then I'm going to talk about the Agile testing goals. And most importantly, what is the mindset shift that needs to happen. And I'm also going to talk about how can test specialists contribute in various events and artifacts? And what about defect management? I will briefly touch base on metrics and documentation. Okay? With that being said, I'm going to directly jump on and talk about what is Agile testing. In my perspective, Agile testing is asynchronous. The dependency on completing the code first and then testing is not needed. For example, a telephone conversation is asynchronous because both parties can talk whenever they like. Testing needs to be done in parallel with development. And without the collaboration between the various specialties in an Agile team, it's definitely not possible. It's going to be somewhat difficult. So how do we do it? Testing needs to be done on an incremental fashion, right from the beginning of the sprint. Why? Because the feedback that you are going to start giving through testing right from the beginning will actually guide development on a daily basis. So that's extremely important, and that's how we can start baking quality right from the beginning. I consider testing as a design activity. You're constantly designing your application with variety of tests. Requirements are going to evolve. Tests are going to evolve. Creativity in all these three circles, requirement, coding, and testing, should and will challenge each other domain. A good test should not be afraid to challenge the way how the code is written or even how the requirement is written. Designing good tests at the appropriate level will ensure the quality of the product. To foster this behavior where you can challenge each other domain, management should trust the team. We should not be measuring team members' performance by how many number of test cases have you written, how many number of bugs have you found, how many lines of code have you written, how many design documents have you produced, so on and so forth. Team success should be measured by the team's ability to produce a high quality, potentially shippable software. I love this picture. This diagram captures the essence of Agile testing. Just for the sake of simplicity, I have listed only two specialists, a coding and a testing specialist. If you look at that picture, I wanted to stress one point. Collaboration is written all over it. You're doing things together as a team. In the beginning, if you look at the leftmost box, both of them are sitting together and trying to understand the work together. And after that, instead of going on their own and trying to build the code and trying to write test cases, I like the bottom box, the second box, which is understanding the mutual domain. What do I mean by that? A coding specialist is trying to understand how are we going to test this. On the other hand, the testing specialist is trying to understand how are we going to build this. That mutual understanding, that early in the process, is extremely critical to build quality right from the beginning. And another thing that I wanted to point out here in this diagram is, from any box to any other box, you see a double-sided arrow. What do I mean by that? Let's say if you're testing the application and if you're finding something, if you're finding an issue, you should not be afraid to go back to your previous step, or you should not be even afraid to go back and start all over again. Why? That's how you are embedding, that's how you're thinking about quality right from that beginning. That quick feedback, trying to do that on a regular basis is extremely critical in an Agile testing world. So what are the Agile testing goals? Quality equals acceptance criteria plus definition of done. I'm hoping many of you are familiar with what acceptance criteria is, right? It's very specific to a specific user story. On the other hand, a definition of done is the common denominator for all the work that will be done by the Agile team. It's the list of items that will determine the doneness of the work, and it needs to be within the organization's boundaries. Quality is also measured by what your customer has to say about the quality. It can be in the form of customer satisfaction survey score, number of sales, how many number of production bugs do we have, net promoter score. So the ultimatum comes from what your customer has to say, right? Last but not the least, and my favorite is fix defects instead of managing them. Especially when we are transitioning from a traditional environment, we always used to have a bug backlog, we do triaging, so on and so forth, right? In the Agile world, try to see how you can deliver a really good quality product. When we have that as a goal, we need to start fixing defects instead of managing them. Okay? Avoid being in a mini waterfall world inside a sprint. I have seen this pattern especially when new teams are transitioning from being in a waterfall world to working in sprints. Maybe first couple of days we'll do some design, then few days for coding, and then last few days for testing. Right? If you kind of get into the pattern, there are going to be some pitfalls if you work in the sequential pattern. What's going to happen if you're finding bunch of issues, bunch of bugs on those last 2 days when you're testing? Do you think your programmers will be able to fix it, and will you be able to retest it, right? So you are going to have all those issues. Worst case scenario, before your sprint review meeting, last day, if you're finding something major, you may not have anything to show during your sprint review for that feedback, right? So try to avoid working in a mini waterfall fashion inside the sprint. I'm always trying to stress, start and think about testing right from the beginning and all along. Okay, so that's going to be a big goal in an Agile testing environment. All right, let me talk about the next topic, which is the mindset, right? What are some of the things that are going to be different, especially if you're transitioning from a traditional world? Number one, collaboration is inevitable. You will see a highest level of collaboration among all team members. It doesn't stop within the team. You're also going to see great collaboration with your customers, with your end users. Where? I can give you one example. During your sprint review meetings, you're inviting your stakeholders and your customers, and it's a working session. It's a highly collaborative session where everybody is looking at what's been done so far, what's the feedback, and what are we going to do next, right? So it's a highly collaborative session. You see that a lot in Agile teams. A lot of swarming, collectively making decisions among the team members. Many times in the traditional world, it tends to be throw it over the wall, right? Us versus them mentality. You don't see that anymore in an Agile world. This is my favorite. The quality of the product that's being developed is the responsibility of the entire team. It's not just the responsibility of the testers anymore. Especially people who are transitioning from the traditional world, this is a big mindset change. So team owns the quality, not just the individual testers. Next, planning is always ongoing. You're not doing a huge upfront planning here. Planning happens quite a bit throughout in an Agile, in an Agile environment. Especially if you're using Scrum framework, I'll use that as an example. You start your sprint with sprint planning. You're planning for that sprint, right? And every day when you meet for those 15 minutes, what are you doing? You're just-in-time planning for the next 24 hours in daily Scrum. Refinements. Backlog refinements is a forward-looking event. You are looking at what's going to come up in the very near future, next 2 to 3 sprints, and you're planning for that, right? So there are a ton of planning happening throughout the sprint. So why? Because we need that feedback. We should be able to change directions based on what we are learning. So it's always going to be ongoing. So please don't waste too much time in huge upfront planning. And that's a big mindset shift. Number 4, communication, especially high fidelity communication, is very critical among Agile team members. One example that I'm going to talk about here is, especially if you're a tester, right? If you're finding an issue and you're very excited about it. In the traditional world, what typically happens is, testers tend to open up a very good detailed bug report. My recommendation here is, yes, that's a good idea, but instead of doing that as your first activity, just get up, go where your programmer is sitting, and sit with them and actually explain what you have found, right? That face-to-face communication, sooner the better. Why? The feedback is actually going to guide the development. So if you're finding an issue, go and talk about it as soon as possible so that you can help fix it immediately, right? So get that going. And then if you have to supplement with the documentation, do it later. But always look out for the high fidelity communication. So this is one of my favorite slides, right? So wherever you are in the spectrum, look from the leftmost, and then you have to kind of traverse in a zigzag fashion to the least preferred. Wherever you are in the spectrum, try to move towards one level to your left, right? If you are sending mails, try to see whether you can send an email. If you are always talking over the phone, see whether you can get the video conferencing going, right? If you are in the video conferencing, see how you can leverage face-to-face communication, right? So try to see whether you can move up and try to leverage the high fidelity communication when you're communicating. Again, why? It's the faster feedback. Next big change. Requirements are not set in stone. You do define something in the beginning, and you will be refining and detailing as you are moving along. That's a big change. In the traditional world, requirements documents need to be signed off before anything else even can start, right? Why? We do need that flexibility. What if something new comes in? What if we learn something new in the market, right? What if we find something different or a new information in your sprint review feedback that we wanted to immediately incorporate? So we don't want our requirements to be set in stone. We need to be flexible enough so that we can adapt, inspect and adapt on a regular basis. Okay, so that's a big mindset shift. The next that I wanted to talk about is talents, cross-functional teams, right? Many of the new Agile teams start with having a bunch of I-shaped specialties. I will explain what an I-shaped specialty is. I-shaped specialty is somebody who has a deep expertise in an area, and their expertise is very deep. For example, if I am a .NET programmer, and if I have deep expertise in .NET programming and nothing else, I am considered an I-shaped specialty. Agile teams honor all specialties, and the newer teams especially tend to start with a lot of I-shaped people together, working together. And as they are progressing, as they are working together, they work with each other. They have a lot of pairing opportunities. They have a lot of swarming opportunities, helping each other out, not just in their specialty area, maybe in additional areas too. So hence, I have seen it, people who are I-shaped transitioning to become a little bit more T-shaped, where you're still maintaining your depth of expertise. I'm still a very deep .NET programmer, but I can also help a little bit help with testing. I can also help in, let's say, database programming, right? So I may not be an expert in that area, but I know just enough to help my peers, my other team members, right? So that happens when you are working together as a team in a collaborative fashion. Again, Agile teams honor all specialties, but they strive to become more T-shaped as they are maturing in their Agile journey. And that's a shift. Typical metrics matter least. So what happens is, I used to send some of these metrics, spent about 4 or 5 hours every Friday spending all this time collecting all these different metrics. How many test cases have we executed? Out of that, how many passed? How many failed? How many mission critical bugs did we find? Severity, priority, all those things, right? I used to spend a ton of time coming up with these metrics and sending them out. Why? At that time, in the traditional world, the stakeholders and people who are the decision makers, the go, no-go decision makers, they had very little insight into what's happening on a regular basis. The development and testing is kind of like a black box. They got to know about what's happening only through some of these metrics and some of these statuses sent to them, right? Using those, they make the decision whether they wanted to put the application in production or not. Not anymore, right? In the Agile world, everything is very transparent. At the end of your sprint, you're inviting your stakeholders, you're inviting your customers, and show them your progress, show them your work, and getting feedback on a regular basis. So some of these metrics doesn't matter anymore because it's not a black box anymore, right? The development and testing is not a black box anymore. They do get to see the progress. They do get to make decisions. They do get to give feedback on a regular basis, okay? So what should we be measuring? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Keep an eye on the big picture. Testers are really, really good at this, even in the traditional environment. Testers really understand the big picture. What's the start? What's the end? Where are we going with this, right? Never ever lose that ability. Even though you may be working in sprints, even though you may be working in a smaller chunk of work at a time, still understand the big picture and still understand where things are plugged into the big picture. Understand the vision. Why? Because that's when your work makes sense to you. Who are your customers? Why are we doing this, right? Always be curious. Never lose your curiosity. So this is not a mindset change, but always tend to look at the big picture here in the Agile world, okay? I talked about this a little bit earlier too, right? What is Agile testing? In the Agile world, testing is not done to find bugs. This is just, again, my personal perspective. Testing is done to give faster feedback, right? There is a slight nuance there. When you are saying you're finding bugs, that means you're kind of seeding an us versus the aha, you know what, I found a bug in your code, kind of like that, right? When you slightly twist it and say that I'm doing testing and I'm finding these issues because I wanted to give feedback faster, it sets the tone a little differently. Now you're talking about it's not us versus them, it's a collaborative team, we all own the quality of the product, and I wanted to share what I'm finding as soon as possible so that we can fix it and we can deliver a high quality product. Okay, so think about the faster feedback. That's very, very important in an Agile team. Last but not the least, in this section, failure is okay. What I wanted to stress is, do your experimentation, fail fast, and importantly, learn from your failure. I'll share a small story here. This happened to one of the teams. So this team, they've been struggling with a ton of manual regression test cases. This is the team that I coached a while ago. And they wanted to do something about it. So they talked about it during the retrospective, and one of their team members, they came up with an action item, said that, hey, I'm interested in going and doing some research, right? Let me figure out how we can automate some of these test cases so it'll become more easier for us. So this person went out there and found this open source tool. I'm sure you're familiar with this, Selenium. Came back and said, you know what, this is a very easy tool. I read about it. We can immediately start recording stuff, and it's with one click we can play back and all our regression scripts will run pretty easily, right? Cool. Okay, everybody was on board with that plan. They tried it, and yeah, it was working well for them until once they started doing new development in their sprints, some of the test cases that were recorded earlier, they started to fail. Why? Because the UI and stuff started changing as the new development is happening. So the previously recorded scripts wasn't working anymore. So they met again as a team, and they decided, this is not going to work for us. We need to figure something else out. So they went again, and they did some more research and came back and said, hey, there's this option called WebDriver. What we can do is, it's not going to do record and playback. It's more scripted testing, and we will have more control over how we are running these, right? It's not just UI record and playback. So they tried that out, and they started developing scripts using the WebDriver part of it, and they started succeeding in it. So the moral of the story that I wanted to bring out here is, it's okay to try something, and make sure that you try it immediately, and if you're failing, that's okay. Fail fast. Don't wait on it. And most importantly, learn from your failure and move on. That's the important part, okay? All right, so we talked about what is Agile testing, and we talked about the mindset shift, right? We talked about a lot of things. Now I wanted to get very specific as to how, as a testing specialist, you can contribute in various events, right? So I'm going to use Scrum as my basis. Majority of the companies, majority of the teams use that. So I'm going to have my events based on that. So the first one that I have here is your sprint planning, right? So if you're a tester, approach the planning from your testing perspective. That's the specialty that you are going to represent, right? So during your planning meeting, I'm sure you can definitely help with identifying what are all the test scenarios. How are we going to test this, right? So try to identify that alongside your team. Always challenge the technical decisions, right? How are we going to test this? Always ask that question, because when you do that, you are challenging your entire team on some of the technical decisions that are being made, so that they have to rethink certain things on how they are going to be coding it, right? On how your programmers are going to be coding it. So from your testing standpoint, do challenge your technical decisions and try to understand them. Most importantly, your ilities, your non-functional requirements, they are not an afterthought. Identify them and ask questions about it. Hey, do we have to worry about performance testing? How much load are we concerned about here? How many user load are we supporting here? What about security testing, right? So think about those ilities and always bring that up, because your ilities, your non-functionals, are not an afterthought. You need to be thinking about that. Your team needs to be devising a solution from that perspective as well, okay? And of course, in your planning meeting, you will definitely be assisting your teams specifically with, what kind of tasks, right, around testing. That's somewhat of a common thing. Next event, backlog refinement. So backlog refinement is a forward-looking event where the teams get together and look at the backlog which are going to be worked on in the near future, right? Next couple of sprints or so. So together with your team, I try to understand the feature, and do try to understand the technical details as much as possible. Why? Because that's when you can start challenging how are we going to test this, right? So it's very important to understand the technical details behind that. Have your team member whiteboard it for you, like have them share that in a simple way. You don't have to be a technical person, but your technical team members should be able to simplify it for you, right? This is a great opportunity for you to get on the same page with your approach. How are we going to approach this? I have seen a lot of testers helping the product owner defining and refining the acceptance criteria. Work with product owners. If you have a business analysis specialty in your team, do work with them, come up with acceptance criteria, right? That's something that you can contribute. Important, effort estimation. When you are, let's say if you're using planning poker, if you're doing story points, make sure your testing items are included in that. Talk about the testing related intricacies. Make sure your team understands where you're coming from, right? It's not just for the programming part. It's not just for the coding part. It needs to be for the entire work. That means it includes testing as well. So make sure you are participating in effort estimation. I've seen many times where testers are excluded from this. So make sure that you are not excluded. Make sure your voice from testing perspective is heard during backlog refinement. Your daily 15 minutes, daily Scrum in the Scrum framework. This is a just-in-time planning meeting for the next 24 hours. And of course, the typical nature is, you will be discussing the progress, right? And what's the plan for the next 24 hours. I also wanted to point out here is this is a great place for testers to find opportunities to collaborate with other team members that may not be of testing specialty, right? This is a great opportunity to proactively find where you can help your other team members. Why? This is how you will become a T-shape, right? Hey, if your programmer is saying, I'm going to be contributing, I'm going to be writing some unit test cases today. Hey, as a tester, can I sit with you? Can I pair up with you? Or at least I can observe what you're doing. Or if your BA specialist is saying, I'm going to be writing some acceptance criteria, maybe this is an opportunity for you to pair up with them, right? Look for those opportunities in this meeting, right, when they say something like that. And of course, do bring up your impediments, especially your testing impediments during this meeting. And please do not wait for this meeting to happen. If you find an impediment, raise that immediately. Go talk to the team member. Don't wait for this meeting to happen to bring this up. But this is probably an opportunity to, hey, I found this impediment. I talked to John about it. This is what is happening. Maybe you can make sure that everybody is aware. An extended team is aware in this meeting. Okay? So it's very important for that. Retrospective. Do bring up your testing pain points, any issues in the quality, and definitely any improvements that you wanted to make for quality. I'll share a story here. Okay? So one of the teams that I worked with a long time ago, we had like literally hundreds and hundreds of manual test cases that we had to execute whenever we got a new build. It was extremely painful. And the cool thing about that is that specific pain point was everybody in my team, irrespective of the specialty, they were all pitching and helping with the testing. What happened was, even though we were doing a great teamwork, it was taking way too much time, and we weren't able to do a lot of new development because of that. So we brought that up during a retrospective. It has become so much of a pain for us. We started talking about that during a retrospective, and we came up with an action item. Our action item was, moving forward, any new feature, any new backlog item that we are developing, it will have an automation test to go along with that. And every sprint, we plan to pick 5 test cases, 5 regression test cases, and we automate that along with that, right? So small improvement, but that was a very actionable thing that we were able to accomplish as a team. So the moral of the story is, we brought that up during the retrospective. We were able to make our pain point, we were able to address our pain point, and we were able to make some improvement to it. And definitely an action item to go along with that. And in the future, we were able to actually automate a lot of those regression test cases. It took a lot of time for us. It wasn't immediate. It took a while for us because we took only 5 over. It was well worth the effort, well worth the effort. Okay, so do remember to bring any of those during your retrospective. So the whole thing, your whole sprint and iteration, you will be definitely spending time in your areas, in your specialty area, which is testing. Make sure that you are offering assistance to whomever in your team whenever possible. It's a great, so I'll give another example on this, right? So if you have a new team member joining your team, I always suggest them pairing up with a seasoned tester, an experienced tester, irrespective of their specialty. Why? A great way to learn the domain is to actually sit with somebody who's testing it and looking through another set of eyes. It's a great learning opportunity, and as a tester, it's a great mentoring opportunity too. So look for those opportunities, okay? And we talked about this, right? In the sprint, do not wait until the end of the sprint to do testing. Try to test right from the beginning in parallel to development. Why? The faster feedback helps development. All right, so we talked about various events. Let me talk about few artifacts where how can testers contribute, okay? The backlog. Again, assist the team, right? Assist the team in even writing user stories, and definitely with acceptance criteria, right? Testers are really good in defining those what-if scenarios, right? So come up with those scenarios. Do assist your product owner. Do assist your team in that. And discuss the test scenarios, right? What-if scenarios. Why? Because your team do need to understand how are we going to test this. We need to design your solution based on some of the scenarios that you are putting in forward. And the more scenarios, what's going to be, what are we going to do it, right? It's going to add more clarity to the work. So please do assist your team in defining and refining these scenarios and acceptance criteria. Product increment, which is your working software, right? So you are a tester who are part of this cross-functional Scrum team, and as a team, including you will be demonstrating the done work, right, during the sprint review. I've always encouraged testers to sometimes review the work with the stakeholders. Oftentimes, I don't see that happening, but I always encourage that. So if you're not doing that, I would recommend or I would encourage you to do the demonstration. Why? we do need to get feedback from your stakeholders and customers, right? You are part of that proud team who delivered a high quality software. So take pride in that and participate actively in your sprint review session. All right. So let's talk about defect management. I wanted to, I'm sorry. So I wanted to talk about this graph. Defect management in the Agile world is all about preventing defects. Agile testing equals defect prevention. So if you look at this graph by Scott Ambler, concentrate on the green lines here. The sooner you're finding the issues, you're reporting it, you're giving that feedback, and we are fixing it, the cost is going to be lower. The later that you are sitting on a defect, it's going to be much, much, much more, right? All right, so we are doing, let's say we are doing all these different things, pair programming, we are doing test-driven development, we are doing parallel testing, we are actively finding defects by discussing with our stakeholders, all these things. Still, we are human beings, right? We still find issues. So what do you do with the bugs? What do you do? So the first thing is determine the shippability, right? What I mean by that is if it's unshippable, that means the work is not done. So determine the shippability as a team. Another thing that I also wanted to put forth is do communicate, be transparent about this with your product owner. Help this person understand the criticality of the bug. Why? Because they are the ones who will be making decisions whether we wanted to proceed with fixing it or putting it in the backlog, right? What are we going to do, right? So make sure your product owner has all the necessary details about this issue. And as a team, determine what the next steps are, right? So write a defect only when fixing it costs more than the value it provides, right? Write a defect only when fixing it costs more than the value it provides. Sometimes, like there are other reasons. You may have a time constraint with a bigger effort. Sometimes, you don't even know what the effort is going to be, right? So those may be some other reasons, but I always try to go back to the basics. Fix them, do not manage them. And if you are in a situation, make sure everybody is on the same page, be transparent about it, and communicate to your product owner. All right? So we talked about metrics, right? So we talked about what doesn't make sense. So let me talk about what makes sense. But before I go there, I wanted to share a small study, Hawthorne effect. So in 1920s, in Western Chicago area, there was this study conducted in an electric company called Hawthorne Electric Company. So the study went like this. So the owners of the company, they wanted to measure the productivity of the workers. So a bunch of experts came in and they did the study. So the study went like this. The first day, the experts increased the light settings in the working floor, and they were trying to see whether it was affecting the productivity, and they measured it. So they had the baseline to check with, so they measured it. Once the light was increased, at the end of the day when they measured the productivity seemed to increase. And the next day, they did the study with a slight variation here. They decreased the light settings from the usual norm if they had the baseline, and they tried to measure the productivity. Guess what happened? The productivity increased again, and this was a huge surprise for the people who were studying. And they conducted the study for a few days, and they kind of concluded it at the time. When people know that when they are being measured, it has an effect in their behavior. So when people know that they are being measured, it alters their behavior. Why am I sharing this story? Because when we are talking about metrics, that means it's some kind of measurement. And if people know that if they are being measured for wrong reasons, they may try to alter the behavior. So I've proposed few metrics, right? Do not take it with a grain of salt here. I've proposed few things. The important metric that should come out of the Scrum team is the working software, right? That's your goal. And why? You need to get the feedback. And that metric is for your whole Scrum team, your stakeholders, your customers, right? And there are a couple of these metrics, your burn down, your velocity trend. That's just for your development team, not for anybody else, right? So there is a very specific purpose, and the audience is pretty specific for specific metrics. Not everything is for everybody, and one size does not fit all. That's the point that I wanted to bring across, right? Again, I will share the evil side of the metrics here with a true story. This team, this program, we had a bunch of teams, I believe 13 or 14 Scrum teams, and during the sprint review, one of the metrics that was captured was unit test coverage. How much code is being covered by unit tests? Last day, this one team, they had about, when they ran their ALM tool, they had about 45%. Last day, before a couple of hours before the sprint review, about 45% of code coverage, and that's not going to hit it. So what they did was, a couple of people jumped on, and they wrote tests, and within like an hour or hour and a half, they were able to up their coverage to 85%. The moral of the story was, don't measure for wrong reason. Within that 1.5 hours, they wrote crappy tests. The tests were not good enough. They're not good quality tests. Are they valuable? Not exactly. They wrote tests because they were being measured on the output, right? They were being measured on the percentage. So it kind of instilled a bad behavior. So the point that I wanted to make across is, whatever you're measuring, do not do one size fits all here. Try to measure for the right reasons. Do not instill bad behaviors. Measure only what provides value. Okay? Documentation. What matters here, right? What to document? A couple of years ago, one of my friend and my peer PhD, Andy Seaman, he gave a lightning talk at the Agile conference. His title was, "Where is the documentation?" He was talking about there are a bunch of documentation. You don't have to produce documentation just for the sake of it, right? There are a bunch of documentations that are readily available, and it can be easily generated with any modern application lifecycle management tools, like Visual Studio, for example, right? I always suggest testers to question the value of the document that you have been asked to produce. Why are we doing this? Who is it going to be used for, right? What's the value behind this? Don't produce documents just because it's in the process or just because somebody asked you to. So with that being said, what are some of the documents that you may be asked to produce? Help documents, user manuals, right? Your deployment documents, definition of done, and additional, typical documents are your product backlog item, if you're an exploratory tester, you probably will be doing those charters, your test scenarios, test cases, so on and so forth. Again, the point that I wanted to make across is the purple line here do just enough documentation and do the ones that provide value, and always question the value when you're asked to provide something. Okay? So I've talked a lot, and I talked a lot about Agile testing and the mindset and how testers can contribute in those events and artifacts, right? So I'm going to conclude with what is not Agile testing. It's not a separate phase. We are not following the traditional stuff here. It's not going to be a separate validation phase. It's not going to be a separate bug fixing phase. It's not going to be a separate pre-release phase. You need to make sure, you need to find a way to start testing right from the beginning and bring all the necessary testing inside your sprint. That means if you have to heavily invest in automation, so be it. Why? Because at the end of the sprint, your team is responsible for a high quality, potentially shippable software. That means you cannot say that, oh, we have done everything, but we need bugs to fix. Well, we have done everything, but we haven't run our regression scripts, right? That's a big no-no here. And please don't have these independent teams to do automation for you. Don't have a separate regression testing team. Do not have a separate performance testing team. Try to bring those knowledge inside your team. Otherwise, you are not going to be in sync with other teams. You may be duplicating work. You may be doing redundant work. There's a lot of waste that will be produced. Okay? So do not have an independent team and do not have a separate testing phase. Try to bring that in. Try to bake the quality right from the beginning. So here, with that being said, here are my favorite resources, some of my favorite books. I would strongly recommend you invest in the copies Agile Testing by Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory, both books 1 and 2. They have 2 books now. And I'm a big fan of exploratory testing. So Elizabeth Hendrickson has an amazing book, so do invest on that. I would also recommend you to follow James Bach and Michael Bolton, context-driven testing. That's their thing. They have written a lot about it. They teach classes on that. I would definitely recommend you follow them. And also specification by example by Goiko. So these are some of my favorite reads. So it's my last slide. In summary, we talked about all these different things. Please do test in parallel to development as much as possible. Quality is owned by the whole team, not just the testers anymore. And most importantly, testing is done to give faster feedback to development on a daily basis. I thank you very much. Here are some of my information. Do send me email, do connect with me in LinkedIn, and do follow my Twitter. And I'm going to turn it over to Ravi for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Pradeepa. That was awesome. This is one of the most highly anticipated sessions in our history. We had the largest number of registrations, attendees, and the largest number of questions. So we are definitely not going to have time for all the questions. So I apologize in advance, but I hope you will make use of Pradeepa's contact information and start asking these questions on Twitter or through email. And also, if you haven't had a chance to submit your questions, please do so now. Again, you can use Twitter. Make sure to mention the handle at Scrum.org and the hashtag ScrumPulse. And also, you can use that screenshot to type in your question in the chat window. So, Pradeepa, there are enough questions for you to do a 2-day training on Agile testing. So I will pick some of the most commonly heard questions. The first question, Pradeepa, I've heard big misunderstanding about Agile, which is, what do testers do on day 1, or how can we start testing in a sprint on day 1? So can you share some thoughts on that question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you very much. Yes, testers can start testing from day one. I wanted to give a few pointers that you can make it actionable immediately. Number one, when you have done your sprint planning, hopefully you're working on your top priority item as a team, right, on day one of your sprint. On day one, why don't you, along with some of your team members, get together and start defining the behaviors of your users, like what if scenarios, right? I'll give you a quick example. If you're developing a bookstore application and you're working on a functionality for coupon validation, talk about what if the coupon is invalid, right? Or what if that coupon, can I reuse the coupon twice, right? Have those what if scenarios. When you're even talking about testing, when you're even thinking about those kind of scenarios that drives the actual end user behaviors, you're actually starting to test on day one. Number two, that's idea number one. Number two, pair between specialties. I am a big proponent of pair testing. I talk a lot in conferences about pair testing, and one of my favorite pair is a pairing between a coding and a testing specialty. So one example, one idea that I'm going to give you which you can start using is, why not pairing up on unit testing? A lot of people look at me like I'm talking crazy talk here, but I do like to stress on that fact that it works, and I have done it several times, and I've coached teams done it several times. Works like magic. You don't have to be a technical person to pair up with your programmer and to start help with unit testing. What am I saying? If you're a programmer who is writing good unit tests, your test name itself should say, like, what is this test for, why are you doing it, and what are the inputs, in simple English. And anybody who's able to read that should be able to ask questions, right? Your testers are really, really good in coming up with those curious questions. What about this? What about that, right? So as a programmer, use that opportunity and have your testers guide you in coming up with good quality unit test cases. I love Mike Cohn's automation pyramid, and the bottom layer of his pyramid, which is the majority of a test, should be good quality unit tests which are intimate to your code. Okay, so that's idea number two. Idea number three, this is a little bit difficult to implement. Create testable task list, right? So when you're planning, when you're coming up with your task list, and your tasks are supposed to be 1 day or less worth of work, right? What about your tasks? You're also making sure your tasks are testable. That means at the end of the day, when the task is complete, you're also making sure it's tested. And these are all things that you can do apart from writing test cases from day one, right? So these are a few techniques that I always like to share with people.
Very cool, Pradeepa. Thank you so much. So folks, we are approaching the end of our time box. I want to be respectful of your time. I have 3 suggestions. Those of you who did not get your questions answered, you could email Pradeepa. You could use Twitter for a conversation and bring in other community members. You can also go to Scrum.org and go to the community page, and we have user forums where people who are facing similar questions as you have shared their answers. And so tap into the power of the Scrum.org community to exchange ideas. So with that, I want to thank Pradeepa, and before we wrap up, I want to tell you just a little bit about Scrum.org. So Scrum.org is a mission-driven company, and Scrum.org exists to improve the profession of software development. And what's most inspiring for me in being a member of the Scrum.org family is the vision. A world in which all software developers love their work and their customers love working with them. And even as I say this, I can feel this. I can feel this world, and what a beautiful world it would be. And we cannot create this world alone. So we need extraordinary people like you to partner with us. So we would love to partner with you, join our discussion groups, join this movement and find different ways in which we can co-create this world together. So go to Scrum.org, and we look forward to this partnership. This session is going to be recorded and be available on YouTube, so I hope you will spread the word with your colleagues, and also on the Scrum.org Scrum Pulse webpage. You can come back, you can watch it as many times as you want. And if you found this valuable, please spread the word, and we hope to see you in our future sessions. And we hope to see ideas from you about what topics are meaningful for you so that we can find speakers to address your needs. So with that, thank you so much for this, for your engagement, for participating, and have a great evening or rest of the day. And we look forward to seeing you in our future sessions. So thank you.
Thank you very much.